much broader than America and much broader than just the South, and the place that Guyana itself played in that imagination and attention. So without further ado, over to you, Briana, and a hearty welcome to the GLC and to you.
Thank you. First, I would like to say good afternoon, and thank you to Michelle, Zachs, David, and everyone here at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the opportunity to further my research, but also to share a little bit of this work, this project with you all. I am in my second year in the Department of Gender and Race Studies at the UA. So this is, for me, this is a time where I am kind of thick in the process of transforming this book project and really writing and researching more of the project. So it's an absolute joy to share some of this work in progress with you all. And I look forward to the conversation or the Q&A afterwards that will hopefully also tell me a little bit about maybe possibly ways that I can go as I begin to transform this work. Okay. And this is just a map, which you can't see very well, but it's a map of British Guiana, formerly British Guiana in 1840. So before getting too deep into the talk, I just want to say that the bulk of the book project takes place in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century, where I am researching and talking about missionaries in the Guianas who are affiliated with African American Protestant institutions. So throughout the talk, you may hear me say AME or NBC, and I am referring to the two Protestant institutions that I am particularly concerned with. So the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, or the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, the NBC. So I am going to begin by giving you an overview of the book project, which is tentatively titled Of Our Stock and Blood, Black Missionaries, the Guianas, and Global Racial Progress, 1838 to 1945, which argues that as the United States emerged as an imperial power during the late 19th century, missionaries of African descent working with African American Protestant institutions basically drew upon their own notions of empire and race to leverage power in both South America and the United States. So the first part of that, I believe like quite a few people have written about, right? This idea that missionaries are sometimes imperialist, right? But the second part of that is what really becomes important for me in my project, and is how they are leveraging power in the Guianas and also in the United States. And what I am specifically concerned about is the ways that women specifically leverage power in the Guianas and the United States. So African American women, but also Afro-Guianese women at the same time. I am also, or I believe, right, that the project also demonstrates a little bit how Black masculinity works as an imperial force, but again, relying on the labor of Black women. So significantly, these missionaries also expanded the place of the Guianas within what they call the, quote, Negro Christian nation and efforts of Black solidarity at the same time in the 19th and early 20th century. So in summation, the missionaries I studied believed in a geographically boundless, quote, Negro Christian nation, unquote, and the work of building that nation as it pertained to British and Dutch Guiana at the time relied on the work of Black women. It's kind of what I am arguing, right? It relied on the labor of Black women. So it begins with full British emancipation in 1838, once apprenticeship is over. And this first chapter, which is the bulk of today's talk, looks at immigration, and it stresses how these people, African Americans, were actually seeing British and Dutch Guiana as a place of hope, a place of progress, and actually a place for the US to emulate once we get into the 1860s. But I'm not going to go into too much detail right now because you will see that very soon. The second chapter, Not Altogether Pleasant Experiences, explores the shift from British and Dutch Guiana as places of hope to places that are actually in need of help and it explores the founding of the AME and NBC foreign missions in the Guianas. Right? Not surprisingly, these foreign missions depended upon the work of Black women, both in the Guianas and in the United States. So the great right arm in sustaining the church in South America, chapter 3, explores the work of women leaders within the church in the US and Black Guianese churches up until 1930. Right? Due to a lack of self-sustaining finances of the churches in the Guianas, African-American church officials, both in the AME and the NBC, gladly handed over duties to Black women. So this in particular is what makes the Guianas special for my project, right? Is that these missions in the Guianas are so poor that it actually creates room for women's leadership as the men in these churches choose to focus on more profitable missions, right? So you'll see like Africa and Haiti receive more attention from men during this time period. And so what develops is a transnational network that is encompassed of adult women who lead in or who led in organizational and financial matters. You have women missionaries, you have local women on the ground in the Guianas who have political aims. And you also have women, like young girls, right? Children, teenagers, and young adult women who hold a tremendous amount of spiritual and social value. And so chapter 4 explores that piece, right? It is titled, "The Race Moves Forward on the Feet of Little Children," and it studies gendered education of children and young adults within Afro-British and Guianese churches that are set up by, Afro-Guianese schools that are set up by these churches, and the importance of education in the missions, but it also talks about children's roles as citizens within this geographically boundless Negro Christian nation. Right? So these citizen roles, indeed, right? Of course, they had gender connotations, but the assigning of citizenship, which is a word that they use, actually at times placed children also as leaders and teachers of adults. Additionally, the 4th chapter explores young adult women who are educated either in the Guianas and what we might think of as trade schools possibly, but also who are educated here at Wilberforce and Tuskegee. And I explore the role that they also play in this kind of transnational network of women who are able to access power in particular ways through foreign missions. The 5th and final chapter is a group of my own women folk, and it shows how the work of the women and children in chapters 2 and 3, those alliances are stronger now, right, in the 1930s and 40s. And it focuses exclusively on the labor of Afro-Guianese women in their communities and the worldviews that they built while connected to AME and NBC churches. Through this process, there are women throughout the book who I am able to trace that I hope demonstrate the ways that their support for foreign missions led to differing avenues of power within the church and within their respective countries in particular ways. So that's kind of an overview of the larger project. And now I'm kind of going to go in and focus on chapter 1, which is titled "The Liberating Prospects of British Guiana." So for the sake of time, I am just going to talk about British Guiana. And my key argument in this chapter is that African Americans, again, envision British Guiana as a place of hope and possibility. And as I was kind of starting this project, I started with the latter half first. And one of the questions I was repeatedly asked, and one that I also asked myself, is like, why British Guiana? Why are they going to British Guiana? How do they even think of going to British Guiana when at the time, what I mostly read about was Africa and Haiti and Canada? And the answer here is immigration and emancipation. So prior to emancipation in the US, African Americans are weighing their options. And of course, immigration is one. So most scholarship about African American immigration or colonization schemes, they center Africa and they center Haiti and Canada, right? And understandably so, that is where you see the larger numbers actually going out, right? The larger number of African American immigrants do choose these locations. but I am arguing that British Guiana and also Trinidad as well, right, should be a part of this conversation. So here is a little bit of an example. This is from 1929, right, from the Mission Herald, which is an NBC periodical. And it basically talks about a man who visited Africa in the 1880s with the purpose of immigration. He is a scout, if you will, for a group of other people. And he goes for some time and then he comes back. So while this example is later than the immigrants that I am specifically going to be focusing on today, it's just an example how in 1929, people are still talking about the immigration experience, right? That it was important that they went to Africa, specifically Africa, and had ideas of migrating, right? And this is used to then solicit money for foreign missions in the 1920s and 30s. So the period of immigration that I mostly see people traveling to British Guiana is 1838 through 1864, with some caveats. I should probably say the period that we see a lot of information, right, about British Guiana, because I don't necessarily see a lot of people going in the 1860s during the Civil War, but there is a lot of information in the newspapers about going, right? But I just listed some of the reasons that I see when I look through newspapers that are specifically talking about immigration to British Guiana and why people go or why they talk about going. One just simply is emancipation, right? In 1838, 1840, right, slavery still exists in the United States and it does not in British Guiana. And so there is an explosion of mentions of British Guiana, and again, also Trinidad, in newspapers and in convention meetings, right? If you look at the colored convention meetings or notes, you will see some talk about immigrating to British Guiana and sometimes immigrating also to Trinidad. Okay. Next is just labor, which you'll see in just a moment. The planter class in British Guiana, former slaveholding class, they want labor and they recruit in the US. And so the promise of jobs becomes appealing to African Americans. And the way that they actually talk about this is in a very masculine way, right? They talk about manhood, they talk about rights and freedom as a way to then be able to say that they are now men, right? They can work and they can support themselves and they can support their families in a way that almost always is in reference to manhood. And you'll see a little bit of that a little later on. Another push factor in the 1850s when you see people begin to leave and go to British Guiana is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. African Americans are terrified, understandably so, and you see a renewed push to travel to British Guiana during this time period. And there are other factors, but these are kind of the top three as I go through personal correspondence and also through the newspapers that people are mentioning. So what happens? A British Guianese society of planners began to send out agents to encourage free people of color to consider British Guiana for their new home. In 1838, a news piece appeared in London encouraging the formation of a, quote, society to promote immigration to the colony, to British Guiana. The society was especially keen to attract workers, and while I don't exactly know like the date or the month when they formed the society in British Guiana, I do know that by later in 1838, they had indeed sent an agent to poach Black workers from the United States. Edward Carberry is his name. He is the agent from British Guiana, and he traveled through the northeast of the United States in search of African-American laborers. He relied on broadsides, and he placed newspaper ads in urban port cities with populations of free African Americans. So in 1838, you begin to see reports in the West Indies, right, in the Caribbean, but you also begin to see these ads appear in newspapers, right, in the Black press, but also in majority white newspapers as well. So he travels to Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, I have been able to see like the most immigrants actually out of Baltimore. And so while relying on newspapers for publications, he also speaks to the churches, right? He recognizes that churches at this time period are a space where he can possibly gain a little bit of traction. And so this is the pamphlet that he hands out in 1839. This one is from Boston. And so it says 1840, but if you find the one from Baltimore, it will say 1839. And what the pamphlet does is it promises a large number of things, right? This is inducements of the colored people of the United States to immigrate to British Guiana by a friend, right? A friend to the colored people. And so he makes the case for immigration. According to the pamphlet, the society searched for, quote, agricultural laborers and mechanics of every kind, but also female domestics and seamstresses. Mechanics received a wage or they were promised a wage of $1 to $2 a day, depending on their skill level, while those who chose to work on the sugar plantations earned 33 1/3 cents at the lowest end of the agricultural wage scale, with, Carberry says, frequently much more given in wages. The society also included housing and medical care for those who worked on sugar plantations. They would also pay for travel for the family of anyone who wished to immigrate, and also educate their children. So this becomes important to note here that while Carberry does say the colony welcomed mechanics, what they truly wanted here were agricultural workers. And I see that very clearly when I visited the archives at Kew, the UK National Archives. You see some of the like, behind the scenes meetings, if you will, and personal correspondence of administrators who are very specific that what they want are agricultural workers to replace like formerly enslaved people on these plantations. For African Americans, they are also very much keyed in on the fact that family, right? That these people would pay for their family to travel and also educate their children. And while administrators think that African Americans are kind of best suited for this work in some particular ways, they are also at the same time recruiting from the West Indies and Sierra Leone. So this next slide just stresses some of what I was just talking about. This comes from the pamphlet. And what it does is that it demonstrates some of the things previously spoken about, but it also stresses the importance of leaving a racist and oppressive United States for something better, right? That is the appeal that Carberry is like making to African Americans, right? So it says it is a great opportunity for African Americans who are at once able, or they are relieving themselves, right, from the great disabilities and disadvantages under which they now labor, and not only of securing a comfortable subsistence and perhaps wealth, but what is of far greater importance both for themselves and their children, full participation in all the rights, privileges, and immunities of freedmen. So this quote talks a little bit about the possibility of wealth, but also this appeal to full participation, right? And there's also the reference for children, which is important, again, as I previously stated. As I dig through the correspondence, what I repeatedly see people mention, whether they go or not, if they are on the side of immigrating to British Guiana, they like the idea that they can take their families, that their children will receive an education. So in the pamphlet, here are things that Carberry promises, or he mentions that Georgetown is a city of refuge, right? He keys in on the fact that there's education for children. There are jobs for African-American women, again, as domestics and seamstresses. He says that they will be given land, and he stresses political participation. But to be clear, certain perks like education, land ownership, like those are only for people who go in and actually work on the sugar plantations, right? These are not for people who are coming as mechanics, right, is the word they use, if you will. So Carberry does actually attract some interest And there's a discussion in Baltimore. There's a Baltimore church where they are discussing, an AME church specifically, where they discuss immigration. Carver speaks. And also there is another agent who was in Baltimore at the same time, and he is the agent from Trinidad, right? And they both speak. And the church decides to send two people out, Nathaniel Peck and Thomas S. Price. And they were chosen during a meeting held at the church, and they set out in December of 1839. They visit both British Guiana and Trinidad. And I should add that Nathaniel Peck has already made at least one immigrationist journey. Previously, he actually goes to Africa. If you are familiar with Stories of Immigration to Africa or the ACS, and you know about Daniel Coker and that kind of first trip, Nathaniel Peck is actually part of the group who travels with Daniel Coker with the assistance of the ACS to Africa in 1820. But Peck actually comes back, right? Whereas Coker goes on to found the West African Methodist Church in Africa. So Peck and Price, this is their report. What you're looking at now is the front of the report that they write when they come back, right? And so they're appointed at the meeting in November and they leave out in December. And this is the report when they come back. And they take their readers on a journey. And as you can tell from the title of this talk, Preference for Guyana, they have a preference for Guyana, and you can tell by the way that they talk about what they see. So here's what they say, right? They say, let us imagine a large and extensive country with the most luxuriant soil, capable of producing everything that grows in a tropical region, right? Everything that grows in a tropical region. And that all the cultivation is confined to the border of the seacoast or along the margins of three mighty rivers. Hence, it is easy to discover the many advantages that this country possesses in a great degree for the enterprising agriculturalist. Again, right, they are stressing agriculture, but also that you could be an enterprising agriculturalist in British Guiana. And again, they talk about like the crops and the soil. And you'll see this slide is just to show you some of the rivers that actually are in Guyana right now during this time. And repeatedly, they talk about farming and life near these rivers and how accessible it is. So Peck and Price also say that they're there, that their purpose is to ascertain the character of the climate, soil, natural productions, and the political and social conditions of the colored inhabitants of the island, which is Trinidad, and the province aforesaid, right? And they make comments on everything. And so here are just a few excerpts, and you don't have to read this. I'm going to pick out certain things from each one, but when they go, the red carpet, if you will, is rolled out, right? So Carberry messages ahead, and he lets people in British Guiana know that Peck and Price are coming. And so they meet the governor, they meet people who are in administration, they meet members of the Black press, they meet Afro-Guianese workers who are actually working on these plantations. They also meet some people who actually have their own land and work for themselves, formerly enslaved people. And so they actually travel up the coast, around the coast of British Guiana. And here are a few of the excerpts and things that they talk about, right? So they talk about, quote, beautiful tablelands, quote, untouched by the hand or feet of man, right? They are really playing these things up. They also say that soil is so fertile that it needs no manuring, and crops and vegetation grows, quote, as if by magic. They also say, quote, the only distinction in society is education, character, and wealth, unquote, and that, quote, many advantages are offered to the industrious and enterprising capitalist, right, unquote. So these reviews about British Guiana are glowing, and they also do write about Trinidad, right? There are things that they like and dislike about Trinidad. But for this, right, they really, really, really hone in on British Guiana, and they talk about British Guiana in a way that kind of like upsells it just a little bit from Trinidad. So they also talk about seeing Black people learning to read, formerly enslaved people learning to read. And they also talk about the importance of religion and take note that there are Black people walking around British Guiana with Bibles. Right? And so, you know, if you remember, an AME church sent them. Peck, I know, is an AME member. I'm not 100% sure about Price, but Price is spoken of as a well-known and well-respected man in Baltimore at the time. Right? So it's not necessarily surprising, right, that they are making notes about the ways that they see Black people connected to Christianity. Scholars of the British Empire might be asking if Peck and Price make note of indentured Indian laborers, and they do, but not much. They make note or mention of indentured Indian labor twice. And in one instance, it is only to prop up African American Christians, right? So they refer to Indian laborers as, quote, people who cannot be prevailed upon to quit their idols, unquote. And then they go in and talk about the influence that African American Christians could have if they choose to migrate to British Guiana. So after Peck and Price leave, around 100 people leave for Trinidad and British Guiana. I have not been able to exactly separate those numbers to get a definite count of who stayed in Trinidad versus who stayed in British Guiana. But initially there's trouble filling this ship. So Carberry has a ship of 100, a ship that can hold 100 people to take to Trinidad and British Guiana. And if you do searches for the newspapers during this time period, what you will find are a lot of ads that initially say that this trip is postponed because they could not find 100 people willing to go, and so they postpone the trip. But eventually they do. They find enough people and they go. And so I know quite a few go, but also quite a few come back, right? There are reports that, quote, many return. However, not everyone agrees with, right? And if you're familiar with immigration schemes and kind of what that conversation looks like, we know that not everyone agrees that this is actually a good thing, right? And so this is from the Colored American in April of 1840. And they published editorials frequently during this year about the dangers of immigration, specifically to British Guiana and to Trinidad, right? So they take shots at Carberry, they take shots at Peck and Price. They also take, they are also upset at times with Garrison over at the Liberator, who was also talking about British Guiana as a possible place to go. And so this particular piece makes note of the disappointment to both immigrants and planners regarding the entire situation, right? That the immigrants had no idea of the discomforts of being in these places, and that planners had an inadequate view of the real position of African Americans who are in the United States. And so this becomes actually quite a long back and forth. Peck and Price issue rebuttals at times. And so you see a lot of back and forth in the Colored American about the idea of immigration and whether or not it is a good thing, and discussions about what immigrants are actually saying about their experience there. But another question is just kind of like, what was, for those who actually went, right? What was the experience actually like? And I have a handful of accounts, of firsthand accounts from immigrants to British Guiana and their visit who go, right, in 1840. And these are a few of the comments that show up in some of their letters, right? I am well at this time, and all the immigrants generally. I am pleased and I am certain that I can make this place, right, British Guiana, my home. And so you see this frequently in the letters that most of them will open up with saying, I am well, right? I am doing well. We made it. We are settled here. I like this place, specifically in contrast to the life that they had in the United States, right? They are making a case for other people to also come with them. Next is an account of a salary. This man says that he is working at about $750 per week, which does line up with his working as a mechanic. And so it does line up with what Carberry promised in his inducements. if you will. But he also says, this person says that he is making $1.25 per day, which lets me know that he's working 6 days a week. But he says that he believes that he can make $1.50 a day. And later in the letter, he stresses that it is this faith that he can earn more, right? He can earn $1.50 a day in British Guiana, where he does not think that would be the case in the US, right? He does not have any kind of faith that he will be able to increase salary of any kind in the United States. There's also a sense of time in these letters. So one person writes that he made the trip from Baltimore to Georgetown in 43 days, but he has a friend who traveled and arrived a little bit later, who made the trip. He was fortunate enough to make the trip in 22 days. That person did not have many storms. And so, but there's also, while things seem very pleasant and great, there's also this acknowledgement, right, that, you know, there are a few who are dissatisfied, but that we may look forward to, we may look for. So yes, people are dissatisfied, but that is to be expected when you have a group of people going out. There are also other firsthand accounts. Again, right, someone saying, I am well pleased with this place, and I think we can live here, right, because this person is there with their family. This person in the second clip, excerpt is actually writing to his parents. And so he says, I would advise you not to come until you hear from me again. So there's a little bit of caution, but he does say that when I tell you to come, bring everything you can, specifically hogs and poultry, et cetera. Right? This is the area where you can truly make money here. And so other things that I learned, and specifically in this 1840 group, is that there's at least one death. There's a woman who dies of the measles. So she catches measles on the ship, and she actually passes away once they reach Georgetown. I also know that at least 2 people either have returned or are in the process of returning to the United States. The letters, there are 2 letters that mention both, you know, the same 2 people, and it's not quite clear. One person says that they are still in Georgetown and preparing to return to the United States. Another letter says that they have returned to the United States. And the letters are only dated 2 days apart, so I'm not quite sure. But people are, you know, returning. And then there's also the separation of spouses. So one of the things that was interesting to me and important for me and my work is the idea of family and like women, right? Are women going, and what does that look like? And I found that there are separation, right? There are a couple family units who go in full and whole. There are also men who go and leave their wives and children behind in the United States. And interestingly enough, there is a woman who I'm very interested in learning more about, who travels to British Guiana. She travels to Georgetown with her children, but she does not actually come with her husband, and she's not widowed. Her husband is actually in the United States. And I know this because she is writing to a friend and telling her friend to tell her husband like how great and wonderful things are. And then there's also a woman who is actually widowed, who actually also makes this trip. And these are from June and July of 1840. But as I continue to look, later in September in a Guianese newspaper, I found a quote from someone else who is disappointed. Well, I don't know what happened with that slide, but what the quote says is, this is a fine country. Oh, there we go. So this is a fine country, but I am afraid to say come, for there may be some disappointed persons. And this shows up in the Royal Gazette of British Guiana in September 1840, but there is no name included with this. And it doesn't give a lot of reasons why they are disappointed, but it does go to show that everything isn't coming up roses, if you will, right? Everything isn't as glowing as Peck and Price spoke about in their journey. And so as we move a little bit forward in time, and I am talking about the idea that the Guianas are seen as a place of hope, African Americans also used British Guiana to push for emancipation in the United States. And so the Christian Recorder is an AME periodical. And in the 1860s, you begin to see titles that I'm going to go over very briefly, such as what would be the effect of emancipation of the slaves and coexistence of the two races after emancipation. Right? And these articles express or stress the wonderful and modern qualities of British Guiana following emancipation. Right? The articles deployed abolition in British Guiana in two ways. One through an examination of labor and production of goods, and through a rebuttal of the idea that formerly enslaved people would constitute a physical threat to the white slaveholding population. And one quote from this article stresses these concerns by stating quite plainly what the concerns are, right? So emancipate all the slaves and they will overrun the North as frogs did Egypt, the days of Moses, and will eat out all its substance, or emancipate them and they will refuse to work and will engage in robbery and murder to obtain the means of living. And British Guiana is offered as evidence to say, no, everything is fine, right? At this point, we've had 20 years, over 20 years of emancipation in British Guiana, and these things have not happened. The articles also say that they talk about production, right? Another concern is production. And they say that in British Guiana, production has actually gone up. But to be clear, the articles ignore the uses of indentured Indian laborers. And as production rates go down, the Christian Recorder, the editor of the Christian Recorder actually says it's okay because production rates are going down because the formerly enslaved people in British Guiana are now working for themselves and for the subsistence of their own family. So this is okay, and this is what we want, right? And so that is what you'll see. That is how the Christian Recorder, those editors are kind of contending with a drop in production numbers, while also saying this is a good thing, emancipation is a good thing, and it is a modern thing, which is also important. In coexistence of the two races, it talks about how well Black and white people in the Guianas get along, but it also talks about how freedom has been good for the colony of British Guiana as Black people built homes and received education, and they are participating in the market. So the success of formerly enslaved people, as African Americans see it, becomes a marker of modernity for a nation. And they are saying the US is behind, the US is not a modern country like British Guiana is because slavery still exists here. This article also talks about the white governors in British Guiana as just men who are liberal, manly, and Christ-like, and that if white men want to be seen in the same way in the United States, again, they should abolish slavery. Now, I would like to point out that the coexistence of the two races after emancipation is actually written by a white Frenchman. And the editors of the Christian Recorders choose to place it in the Christian Recorder because they think it is important for people in the US to actually see a white man saying these things, right? That it isn't just Black people talking about needs for abolishment, that it's important to see a white man calling the US backwards and not modern because slavery is still in existence here. So if my book centers the foreign missions of the AME and NBC, why talk about immigration and the way that British Guiana is kind of seen in history as this place of hope? And the first is just simply that the AME Church in Baltimore broadly keeps up with the immigrants in British Guiana. Like the letters are scarce, few and far between, but they are there, right? The church loosely does keep up with them. And the second reason I'd like to bring you back to the issue of the Mission Herald in 1925. What I blocked out in the beginning is actually who this man is. This man is actually L.G. Jordan, or Lewis Garnett Jordan, who becomes the longest running Secretary of Missions for the NBC, right? The group of people that he goes to check out Africa for are actually his own church members who are in Texas at the time he's in Texas. in the 1880s. And while there, he does believe that African Americans, quote, might have a tough go of living there permanently, but he does say that he fell in love with the land, he fell in love with the people, and he comes back and immediately begins foreign missions in the United States for the NBC. He sees it as a place, again, that's kind of connected, right, to African Americans in very clear and distinct ways, but he also believes in proselytization of Africans to Africans, right? And through the immigration, his immigrationist connections is how his eyes are actually opened up to the idea of British Guiana being a place that is ripe with possibility. And so again, it's just kind of like these ties, right, that I am trying to tie in for the rest of the book to think about the ways that immigration to British Guiana then becomes an important foundation for the missionaries later on in the book project. But if I take a step back, there's still that transition piece that I talked about from chapter 1 to chapter 2, the idea of British Guiana as a place of hope, a place of possibility, a place to go to and live, versus a place that's actually in need of help, and specifically African American aid. So as enslaved people, as emancipation happens in the United States, what you begin to see is a change in language. And so here is just an example that says, hurry up. And it's basically saying like they need to hurry up if they do not wish us to overtake and pass them in the chase. It's from an article titled What Our Foreign Brethren Think of Us. And the quote is essentially saying that Black people in British Guiana have fallen behind. They've had over 20 years on us in emancipation, and they need to, in some ways, like get things together unless, or else we African Americans will overtake them. And you really begin to see this language open up in a lot of periodicals and publications, particularly during and after Reconstruction, right? And then you begin to see the establishment of the missions in the Guianas. So I like to end all of my talks about the Guianas with this picture of one of the churches that I studied. This is St. Peter's AME in Georgetown. I took this in 2017, but it was one of the first churches established. So the church is over 100 years old, still in existence. And thank you all very much for coming to the talk, and I look forward to the Q&A and discussion. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Briana. It's been so great to have you here, and it's wonderful to hear more about your work. It's really exciting project. And we have several questions in the Q&A, but I just want to kick things off by asking if you could say a little bit more. I know, because I've had the privilege of reading your proposal and talking to you a little bit, that you see this this whole process of immigration as part of a larger piece of the imperial story, right? That the Black women's work is part of the project of building and sustaining empire, as you say. And I wonder if you could just talk about that kind of bigger context a little bit, and what you mean by that.
Sure. So basically what you have in the church is you have an appeal and a call for donations, if you will, right, to help sustain these foreign missions. And as some scholars have already shown, like Walleen Dotson, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, have shown like the importance of Black women and their financial contributions, just in general to the church. And what I have found through this is that if you specifically look at the Guianas, you find ways that women are able to enter into leadership roles in specific ways, and that for the Guianas particularly has like a tremendous effect. So what I am doing, like I trace basically particular women that I'm able to trace throughout most of the project. Excitingly enough, I might now have a woman that I can trace from immigration through the beginning of the project, which is actually something I found while here at Yale, which is very exciting.
That's terrific.
But just thinking about the ways that, in some ways these missionaries are imperialists. They literally at one point they say that they are, quote, riding the coattails of US empire, unquote, in order to build up and establish what they also call and think of as a Negro Christian nation. And so I am just exploring the ways that women, through their work in foreign missions, are able to kind of gain a little bit more leverage, right? They gain some actually pretty powerful positions within the church, but also outside of the church because of the work that they were doing in foreign missions in British Guiana specifically, and Dutch Guiana as well.
Well, that's really fascinating to me, that there would be this sensibility of feeling a sense of belonging to the U.S. imperial project. I wouldn't expect that. Maybe that's my own naivete. But
so it's complicated, right? And so you see a lot of conversation in personal correspondence about how they actually do think that this is problematic, but in some ways they don't necessarily see another avenue, right? The main goal for them, the priority, is to spread the gospel, right? And they see US empire as a way that kind of opens that up for them in some ways a little bit, but they are conflicted, if you will, right? And there are other people who are very outspoken about the evils of US empire, the evils of US imperialism. And then you have some people who are a little bit on the fence, if you will. It is a means to an end, right? And so there's always that tension, there's always that conversation. They are aware of what they're doing and they're not necessarily okay with it, but they also see, right, the primary goal of spreading the gospel. There's also like civilization talk, right? That we can civilize, quote, civilize some of these people in particular ways, but they also talk about the ways that they are connected through slavery to Black people in Africa, in the Guianas, in the Caribbean, and they see themselves as better suited to do this work than white missionaries, if you will, right? Through, particular ways they write. There's a lot of dialogue about that piece of it, if you will.
Wow, really fascinating connections and tensions. Well, we'll have to talk more. We should probably get to the questions because there's a lot of them. David Blight was commenting in the chat about just the Baltimore connections and, how fascinating that this is in some ways this kind of transnational Baltimore-based story, and he was just commenting on the huge size of the free Black population in Baltimore, and that it's a maritime community. And then also in the Q&A, a good friend of the GLC, Lois McMillan, who's a master teacher. She's based in Oregon. She was asking whether you have evidence of any of the advertisements or pamphlets making their way to southern ports through African-American sailors. So again, that maritime dimension. Do you have anything you want to say about that?
I do not at this time, but that's such an that's very interesting for me to think about. But I do not. I'll
share the Q&A with you, so
okay.
You'll have a record of that.
Okay.
Of that question. Okay, so there's lots of other questions. Here's one from Charlie Rosenbaum. What lessons can African Americans draw from the historical events of emigration to British Guiana, and how can those lessons be applied to the present day?
I think one, I think is this idea of solidarity across the globe, right? And so you see, particularly in the early moments, right, where we're talking about British Guiana, you see this idea of Black solidarity in particular ways. You see a nation that is thought of as this really great and wonderful place for Black people and certain ideas of we need to do whatever we can do to make the best situation for ourselves. But at the same time, I think well, not even I think, right? Peck and Price, for example, absolutely ignore the material conditions of what formerly enslaved people in the Guianas are actually living like at the time, right? And so I think in one instance that we can kind of pull right, these ideas and how we think about and talk about Black freedom and Black solidarity in particular ways that don't necessarily privilege, right, an African-American experience, right, or African-American viewpoint. I think those are absolutely things that we can pull from this idea of immigration to the past and to the present, right, is how really when I think about how sometimes history is taught, right, and how like centered we are on the US, right? And so someone who, like my specialization was African diaspora history. So of course I am kind of taking this route or this view, but I think there are ways to talk about African-American history in ways that don't always necessarily have to center the US, right? And think about like the ways that we can expand the teaching, right, of how we teach and talk about Black people and their connections across the Americas, right, or across the globe, if you will, and not necessarily just in the United States. So,
Deja, I'm wondering if you want to jump in with a question or comment. I know that this is an interest of yours. Do you have a question or anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm definitely, I think that that's such a good point of kind of putting all of these kind of decentering the US narrative from the Black experience, which is so dominant. Where do you see this work kind of fitting into, as you kind of mentioned as well in your proposal, of just the burgeoning field of Black internationalism? Where do you kind of place this book?
Sure, that has actually been a question that I have been grappling with, right? So when you mostly hear about or read about Black internationalism, you are normally reading about anti-colonial struggles, right? People who identify as Marxist or socialist, right? People who are very much outspoken against US empire and empire more generally. And that isn't necessarily what my missionaries are doing, right? And so they do have conversations about, and that is a quote, right? The evils of US empire is a quote that actually appears in one of the publications a few times. But at the same time, they aren't necessarily saying abolish it all, right? And so where these people fit in to concepts of Black internationalism is something that I'm actually still grappling with. I think, right, I am kind of dealing with how to frame these people who have some of these anti-colonial sensibilities, but who aren't necessarily at all times, right, as a whole, if you will, aren't necessarily as forthright and open about the need to like tear away from some of these issues as well, right? That the missionaries I study very much believe in African-American exceptionalism. While they may not necessarily believe in all the time in ideas of US empire, they do believe that they are better suited for particular things because they are African-American. And that there are things that they can like teach, you know, other people. Again, so you fall into this civilizationist discourse. So yeah, that is all to say I'm still grappling with that idea, right? How do I talk about these particular people within the discussion of Black internationalism?
And I think a good follow-up to that question, we have Michelle who asks, it sounds like all your actors are kind of buying into the notions of industriousness, uplift, hard work, discipline, and capitalism as inherent goods. Are there any examples of resistance to those discourses that you've been able to find or identify?
No, not necessarily. And it's interesting, right? Because at least from what I've been able to find, even the people who say immigration is an awful idea, even those people believe in the ideas of uplift, right? They believe in the idea of being industrious, right? So the people who are writing editorials, right, that are against ideas of immigration. They still believe in kind of those core components of, being like a good worker, right? Ideas of uplift. And so they aren't necessarily talking against those specific features. What they're talking about is the idea that you can do it in British Guiana, right? They are saying the planter class there ultimately is going to be no different, right? Or they are saying that, you need to stay here and fight for some of these things in the United States, right? So they're just not hopeful about the conditions in British Guiana, but they don't necessarily attack the ideas of like in being industrious, right? Being an enterprising capitalist, right? They don't necessarily talk against those ideas. It's just the location, right, at which they're doing.
And we have a question from the historian Namada Blyden, whose work intersects with yours, I think. She asks if you can speak to the idea of African Americans choosing the West Indies instead of, or as an alternative to Africa for whatever reason, proximity to the US, stereotypes about Africa, etc. Sure.
And so I know, for example, Trinidad, right? I like to hold up Trinidad frequently. So yes, and so you have larger numbers going to Africa, that is without question, because they see Africa as either the fatherland, the motherland, right? And there's a reason to go back and redeem Africa, if you will. The West Indies, at least from what I have seen, a larger number of conversations happen about Haiti. And they talk about Haiti as a Black republic, right? A place of Black kings and queens and a place where they can go and experience freedom. But they also go to Trinidad. And one issue is just very simply that it is easier for them to get to. And so they go. English, right? English being spoken in like Trinidad, for example, is one of the things that gets Trinidad like larger numbers. At times, it depends on the years, right? But at times, Trinidad has larger numbers of African-American immigrants than Haiti does. So some of that is English. But there's also, again, just this idea of being close and like this tropical idea of the Caribbean, right? Is what I see a lot of people writing about, is what it looks like, what it feels like, that you're surrounded by the ocean. But they also have very large numbers of Black people, like Africa does. And they will also, mention that as well, right? That they are surrounded by people who look like them, and who are also struggling in some ways, in some of the same ways that they are or were as well. And so that's kind of at least what I have seen. And honestly, most of the people who go to the West Indies, the Caribbean, they do talk, about how they considered Africa. And most of what I've seen is them choosing not to go because they feel like the West Indies are, quote, more civilized, if you will, right? They believe that the people, the landscape are more civilized, right? And some of that is really you're talking about language, about like colonization. And while they may say, colonization is this evil, they again also talk about modernity in ways in the West Indies, in ways that they don't necessarily talk about modernity in Africa at times. And so that leads into their decision to choose places in the Caribbean versus Africa. But again, the larger numbers do actually go to Africa. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Okay, you've got lots of questions for you. So Alicia Hall, who is a recent PhD from here at Yale, wonderful scholar who you two should get together at some point. She asks, you note some of the caution some African Americans who migrated there expressed about what life would actually be like once there. And you mentioned the example of the person who was able to make more money there than they would anywhere else. She's wondering if you can say more about life for African Americans once they got to Guyana. And have you noticed anything about their interactions with Black people from the island or
So
from the colony?
can actually tell you very little of full transparency. I actually found those documents maybe 2 days ago. So
Here at Yale.
I know. So I haven't been able to do the digging that I will do, over the next few weeks. But what I do know is that they do have homes, right? So the person who was working as a mechanic is actually living in a small home on another Black person who was a member of the Black press in British Guiana in Georgetown. That particular immigrant is living in a small home on the editor's property. Some of those who are working in agriculture are living in small properties on the sugar plantations. So I would assume, I don't know, but I would assume they were properties that the formerly enslaved people live in at the time. I know that there is some contact with other workers on these former plantations, but I don't actually know what that looks like right now. And I know that through the connection of the Black press, right, that some of these reports get into the Black press, but what things actually fully look like on the ground right now, I don't fully know for them because I just found those documents. But I can say that I am so excited about it because I've been looking for firsthand accounts for years. So to finally have found those documents is actually very exciting for me and also exciting for the project, right? Some of the letters were written by women, so I am thrilled about that. But what they are mostly writing about are their interactions with each other, right? Is what I am mostly gleaning from the letters right now. But because I have names, for one letter, I have an address. So I am very optimistic that things will open up and hopefully we can connect. And as I kind of go through this journey, right, also be able to share some of that information.
Well, that's exciting. And I'm personally so glad to hear that this has been a fruitful time for you and that you're finding new stuff. So we have a question from another fellow here at Yale right now, Evan Turiano, who's a fellow at the Beinecke and the GLC this semester. And he asks, when early British Guiana immigration boosters were pitching it, particularly talking about emancipation and opportunities for African Americans, were they talking about these things they see as true across the British Empire, or did they see some unique characteristics of British Guiana within that bigger context?
Sure. So what I see most often is the discourse between Trinidad and British Guiana. And they think that there are opportunities. Basically, they believe that, specifically Peck and Price, when I'm saying they believe that there's just more opportunity in British Guiana. They like the governors better in British Guiana, which is interesting because at times, the governors just simply switch from Trinidad to British Guiana, right? But at the time they go, they like the governors in British Guiana a little bit more. They believe that there is, again, more opportunity. They believe that there's less racism in British Guiana than in Trinidad. And so that leads to, they also believe that the soil is better, right? So when you're talking about agriculture and working as farmers, if you will, they believe that that is a better opportunity in British Guiana specifically. And they also note that they see more of the formerly enslaved in British Guiana with their own properties, who are working for themselves versus what they see in Trinidad.
Oh, interesting. Okay, still more questions. Manuel Rendero, I'm sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, forgive me, asks, based on the political discourses on immigration to the Guianas, how do you see the making of concepts like untouched nature and fertile tropical environment in relation to hopes of emancipation and mobility of Black peoples across the Americas? It's quite similar narrative to processes happening in French Guiana and in Portuguese, Brazilian Amazon in the 19th century.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was telling some of the panelists before that this project actually started in Brazil, right? This was supposed to be, I entered NYU as a Brazilianist and the project fell apart in the archives. And so a switch had to be made. But yes, you're right. Like, there are similar discourses that you hear about. Specifically, I'm like more familiar with what's happening in Brazil, but yes, absolutely. And so it's interesting because, I mean, some of this, right, absolutely speaks to like erasure in a sense, right? I find it hard to believe. I know where Peck and Price traveled, and they traveled through like heavily populated locations, right? So it's very difficult to believe that land and like tabletops of land have been untouched by any human hand or feet, right? So there's this idea of erasure that I am or have been like thinking through, but also just the way that they kind of describe the Guianas at one point as, quote, pregnant with possibility, right? Like how fertile the land is, if you will. And so you hear those ideas, right? These the pieces of discourse, and actually, like, you also have to think about like how they're trying to sell, you know, at the same time, right? They're trying to sell Guianas, but those ideas also, I think, bring to mind for people the ideas of emancipation in the US. So even people who are saying, don't immigrate, right, stay here, they're still able to use some of these descriptions. Even so, if we're not even talking the 1860s, we're still in the 1840s. So even in the 1840s, they're still using these descriptions to say, this is what the US could have, right? This is what we could actually do here in the United States, politically, right? Not just talking about ideas of labor, but they are politically saying, like, this is an example of what could be possible, right? The possibilities here in the US if we achieve emancipation. And again, ideas of modernity as well, and also talking about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hey, we still have several more questions. Another good friend of the GLC, Adi Van Dyke, asks whether the African American women are taking ministerial roles in the churches in British Guiana, and when did that start? What were those processes like?
They are. So, but initially it is unofficial. And so if you check official records of ministers in Guianas, in the NBC and in the AME, and they have pretty good records of that, you will not see the women there. Where you find women as ministers are actually in the personal correspondence. And sometimes it's written in ways where, you know, I think maybe they let this slip, right? Or they are writing in ways that you can tell no one else is supposed to see this. And so it is not a secret in the Guianas that women are having ministerial positions. It is somewhat of a secret to the Black US public, right, that these women are having ministerial positions, but they absolutely do. And they are listed as ministers such and such. Or, you know, sometimes they will say minister, you know, whoever, right, is the wife of minister, you know, whoever. Or at times they don't necessarily use the term minister, but they will say that Mrs. such and such gave a sermon, right? And they will specifically use the term sermon, that she gave a sermon to the church. And, you know, she does so like once every 3 months or something like that. And so they are, but it's not necessarily at the time on official AME and NBC roles. And that begins very early. It begins very early.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We have a couple of comments and questions from people with connections to Guyana, just thanking you for this talk and finding it really fascinating. One says that she still has family residing there. Her paternal grandfather, who is Indian, was a tailor shoemaker. His brother was a seaman. And she'd be interested in talking with you offline. So we can try to put you together. And then another person, Roxanne Callender, says that she's Guianese and lives in the US. And she says that she's surprised that this immigration history from the US never made it into Guianese history books. The immigration history that they learn is about the arrival of indentured servants from East India, China, Portugal, and other Caribbean islands. So that's interesting. And she also asks if you happen to know whether you have noticed any African-American immigration to Barbados. I know that's not exactly your topic, but is that something that you've come across?
Sure, I think a couple things. One is, so the numbers are, I will say, like, the numbers are small that I've been able to find so far. So far, if we're looking at like the 1840 group, I've been able to put names with about 22 people, right? And so, you know, so it's smaller versus the large, very large number of indentured Indian workers who end up coming to the Guianas. But I know there is some immigration to Barbados, but I have not studied it, so I cannot necessarily give you specifics. And for the previous comment, I will also add that one thing that's not, you know, part of this talk is that while the AME and NBC are talking about, quote, a Negro Christian nation, they do have like Indian members of their churches, right? And they mark them down, like how many did they baptize, you know, for the month. And so they are also included in this, quote, Negro, right, Christian nation as well.
Oh, great. Well, I think we're about ready to close up. I'll just share one last comment. I think you've already addressed this, but this person says that Guyana seems like an interesting example of Pan-Africanism and Black solidarity. And they're comparing it to immigration schemes led by the Pan-Africanists in the 1970s with writer Julian Mayfield. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Okay, well, great. I think we can close out here. And thank you again for this fascinating talk. And thank you for, you know, being with us here at the GLC and for sharing your work with all of us.
Oh, thank you so much. And anyone, feel free to email me. My email is royst001@ua.edu, or when this is posted on YouTube, it's on the opening slide of my presentation. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Michelle and Daisha and David as well. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks. Thank you, everybody.